Dust. It painted the shanties we passed and packed the dirt paths our boots trotted against. It blew with the wind and stuck in your throat like that stubborn old goat that just won't. It's all nature ever sent our way for most of my 17 years, I'd reckon. Daddy asked for food, money, or shelter, but dust instead. Mama wanted everything for Kyle and me: education, manners, a reason to smile, but dust instead. It had been at least a few good years since the last storm, but we knew it was fixing to come. Miss Nature never missed a chance to spoil our fouled existence with more dust. Mom had been gone for what didn't feel like too long ago, but now that I lean on this bar, counting the years, my 7 fingers make the years feel as long as they are. I passed my eyes back to my brother. Kyle's glowing face and blonde locks was a spitting image of her. I sometimes saw her reflection in his matching hazel eyes. She'd always said that Kyle and I were 2 years apart. Assuming my assumptions about my own age are accurate, that would put Kyle at 15 now. I've shared all my memories with him. Heck, he was around before I could even remember stuff. The years get harder to count as we wandered on, but if I had to guess at it, I'd say Daddy died about 4 years ago. I at least know it was 3 years after Mom. Daddy was real adamant about having a calendar and keeping track of time. Dust got in their lungs and took 'em both. After Mama, I kinda reckon Daddy more or less let it take him. His boys were full-grown adults, plenty ready to fend for themselves, and his true love had left him, so he followed her down that path. I can still see him clear as day in my memories. That familiar visual, his deeply tanned skin, tall, gangly figure, dark chocolate waves of hair that matched his eyes. Hell, take 17 years off him, plop a white curly-brimmed hat on his head, and you're looking at me. Kyle and I have been wandering since the day Daddy passed. Wasn't anything for us in our hometown. Stone-Tooth's what they called it. And the shanty we lived in would blow apart every dustnado anyway. Dustnados were commonplace in Stone-Tooth. We got hit by 4 a year on a slow year. Our shanty was more like a wind chime than a housing structure. We were the only family we had, and we didn't rightfully mind it that way neither. Kyle and I have been traveling from town to town for years now, looking for work and moving along once the market dried out. And the market's always dried out. "Get back to work, Donald!" our boss barked. I looked up from the bar into the thick of the tables. They were splintered, sorry pieces of wood nailed together to form tables and chairs. Haggard drunks filled most of the available seatings. Shady salesmen, clumsy repairmen, and hideous harlots. These were the ever-revered members of Mootown's working class. Same people who'd turned their noses up to wastelanders like Kyle and I. Wastelanding was far from easy, but we had our freedom. Donald's frumpy self sagged the chair legs beneath him. His bald spot screamed from the sea of people. Poor old goat was losing hair like a chicken loses eggs. He had that familiar slithering smile plastered on his cracking lips. He was sowing some sexy lies with one of those chunkier harlots. The bar hands ain't supposed to talk with the patrons. Donald wouldn't be getting paid today. He was raised on the beliefs of that great hippofoo or whatever. His whirly whiskers were evidence enough of that, but I couldn't help but wonder if incessant flirting was one of the founding pillars of that belief systems, too. We'd picked up Donald a couple towns back. Kyle and I were working in a mine. It was dang dirty work. 3 months in that mine and we had a major collapse. We scrambled like hell out of that mine. One of the support beams collapsed onto Kyle, pinning his legs down. Alone, I could only do so much to help us out of that fallen death pit. Lucky for us, Donald noticed our struggle and turned back to help. If not for his efforts, we'd both collapsed within that mine. Kyle and I were skipping town after all that, but we were stopped by a gathering crowd outside the local brothel. Turns out Donald had gotten himself in some sort of trouble. Well, we owed him a favor. So we snuck our way around the back to help find a way out for Donald. We distracted the crowd long enough for Donald to sneak out the back window. With our favor repaid, we snuck out of town and headed for the next job. We'd heard Moontown was the place to be, except we were accompanied by Donald. We were even, and I didn't want the company. But Kyle seemed all too thrilled by it, so I conceded. We've been in Moontown now for the past 2.5 months or so. There ain't much work in this town, leaving Kyle and me to bartend night after night. Moontown was a major drinking town, famous for booze and nothing else. The other Wastelanders had promised work here in Moontown. I suppose that bartending is work, just not the work either of us had in mind. It was, after all, one of the unspoken rules of wastelanding. Bars will always have work for Wastelanders. This was due in part because Wastelanders made up most of the bar's profits. As a second half of that rule, it was courtesy for a Wastelander to leave the bar after a couple days' work, opening the job for the next guy. To support the claims of our predecessors, there are plenty of bars here, which in turns means there was plenty of work here for a Wastelander. But Kyle and I were wanting something a little more permanent. We'd worked most of the bars in Moontown, and its circuit would be drying up soon. I could just about feel it at this point. We needed to be looking for our next stop, and soon. "What are you thinking, you idiot?" Our boss slapped Donald right on his bald spot as he walked to the bar. Bar hands aren't to be talking to the patrons in this bar. She started the conversation with me. Donald rubbed the back of his head. She's a harlot, our boss spat. She talks anything with a dick. I hope you realize you aren't getting paid today. Oh, come on, boss, Donald begged. I gave you 8 good hours today. You barely gave me 6. The boss reached into his tip jar from beneath the bar. He slapped a 20 in front of Kyle and another in front of me. I snatched another regular day's pay off the counter. I pulled Betty off my head, turned her upside down, and stuffed my payment into her deep crown. I plopped Betty back onto my head and fixed her dusty white brim so that its curve matched my eyebrows. The boss slapped 14 bills in front of Donald. Thank you, sir. Donald cradled his partial payment. Yeah, the boss groaned. Now get out of here, the lot of you. The boss's hairy forearm guided us to the exit. We stepped out the back exit, which led into an alley. The backs of these shanties that lined either side of this alley headed deep east and west. Bars, inns, food suppliers, knick-knack shops, and so much more lined these alleys. The alleys were a crummy place to spend the nights, but they were free. Beggars came more often than I cared to count. I assumed they'd learned to stop asking a bunch of poor wastelanders for handouts. It takes every penny to keep myself clothed and fed, which didn't leave much for lazy bums. But I'm always quickly reminded as to why they come back around here whenever I watch Kyle give $1 to our 4 frequent vagabonds. He somehow was more frugal than I. Those donations occurred on every working day, and yet Kyle never ran out of food, money, or goodwill. I didn't get it. We pressed on through the alley looking for an unused spot to set up camp. We hadn't trucked too far from our bar before running into a familiar obstacle. There in the alley stood our newest fan. A young boy had been trailing us for the past 3 nights. He and Kyle were really fast friends. He was a strange child, his skin tanned red, his brown hair messier than a plate of goulash, and seemingly mute. These meetings were becoming routine, and it was time I addressed it. Kyle had already won over the favor of Donald, and this child seemed to be next. Although I didn't object, I didn't intend to make a habit out of adopting any more extra baggage, but the baggage this young boy carried outweighed the 3 of us tenfold. Can he travel with us? Kyle begged. I was surprised I didn't hear this one sooner. No, I retorted. He's just a kid, Kyle scolded. We can't leave him alone. He's a kid, I confirmed. And kids can't work. The last thing we need is another mouth to feed that ain't adding any money to the pot. Donald can barely work between flirting fits, and you keep him. Kyle stepped in my face. I don't keep Donald around by choice, I asserted. He's here because you insisted upon letting him come along. We aren't adopting anyone else, Kyle. Hey! A man shouted from behind me. I turned to face him and his army of goons with frown-fixed faces. They're taking our meal ticket! They shouted and began to close in. Instincts kicked in. Kyle swooped up the kid while Donald and I led the way. We kicked up a dust trail, turning down every other alley and diving in and out of bars. We were young and slick and lost our pursuers quicker than a snake bite. Once I was comfortable with the distance we'd created, I signaled for a stop. During our time bartending, we'd grown familiar with these back alleys. We'd worked most of the bars in the circuit, anywho. Despite all that, we still wound up behind one of the 3 bars in town we hadn't tended for. The Musty Tavern. It was aptly named, and hosts mostly to convicts. A place I wasn't too keen on bringing Kyle to, but with our pursuers and all familiar territory behind us, our choices were scarce. We slipped into the alley and entered the Musty Tavern from the rear exit. Seedy faces were fixed on the winded youngsters who just entered their bar from the exit. We played it cool with smiles, but our cover was blown upon entrance. The tables had been cleared to either side of the room as Moontown drunks redefined happy hour. The floorboards creaked beneath our feet. Just another hastily thrown together shack of a bar inn. After working so many, all these dives felt the same. Fancy light sockets were strung through the ceiling, but I knew this place didn't have no electricity. Probably no bulbs, neither. The oil lamps that sat on every surface was evidence enough that they couldn't use them fancy sockets. But most places had torn them out entirely. We'd worked through droves of drunks, stumble dancing to sporadic piano mashing. Kyle and his young friend cruised through the scene with such amusement on their faces. Donald's eyes darted this way and that, probably looking for the drunkest woman in the crowd. I was headed for the stairs. I thought about blending in with the crowd, but should our hungry hunters show up, there'd be no place for us to run. I had to keep my eyes over my shoulder to make sure Kyle didn't get lost in their laughter, and to be sure Donald didn't make any moves. I led my team up to the bar's 2nd floor. There was less prying eyes up there, and most drunks were scared of heights. Kyle and him giggled their way up behind me, and a distracted Donald took up the rear. We settled at the back half of the bar nearest the inn's rooms. Kyle offloaded his little buddy, and it was time for me to get some answers. I approached the kid with my friendliest smile and a mind full of whys. I'm Henry, I introduced myself. It's like Henry, without the H. That's what I tell people. The little one gave that a giggle. This old fellow behind me is Donald. We picked him up a couple towns back. He's probably 30-something, old as dust, but harmless anyway. And that man whose hand you're holding is my own baby brother Kyle. He's so smitten on you, I'd watch out for a kiss. I smirked with a wink. The kid giggled back. All right, then, I said. What did you do to piss them men off? I asked. He reached into his vest pocket and retrieved a ragged old blue handkerchief. It was folded real nice and tied in a bow. His grimy fingers undid the bow and revealed the treasure of 2 cornbread muffins within the worn fabric. 2 cornbread muffins? I dismissed his concerns with a wave. Why, we should have enough cornbread muffins to feed those guys. I looked back at the little guy, and he was shaking his head quite rapidly. No, he made that answer very clear. He then pointed to the muffin, and then back to himself. I was baffled. I imagine my face told him that well enough. He pointed back to the muffin and bit a chunk out of it. He then pointed back to himself and pretended to bite a chunk out of himself. Took me a second, but I had a hunch. They wanted to eat you? I asked. He nodded. Well, we can't let that happen. I stood straight and leaned against the wall. I wasn't thrilled about adopting this darn kid, but I couldn't rightfully leave him to a bunch of cannibals neither. I reckon I knew from the get-go I'd be caving in to Kyle on this one. I at least wanted to make him work for it. But my hands were forced, and it was time to play it out.